Hey, Rebel Rouser. I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7 by 7 So, when George Lucas set out to make Star Wars, one of the things that we know, of course, is that he was basing Star Wars on a lot of the work of Joseph Campbell and the idea of the monomyth, which has been since codified into an idea called the hero's journey, and that was done by a gentleman named Christopher Vogler, who was trying to give Hollywood movie developers an idea as to how to look at Joseph Campbell's work and codify it and create a form, if not a formula, for being able to develop movies with characters that follow along a hero's journey. But that isn't the only thing that George Lucas was up to with the original Star Wars and in subsequent movies as well. Star Wars has always taken inspiration from historical events and political events. For example, the fact that Emperor Palpatine could be said to have been based on Richard Nixon in a way, and yet he is not Nixon as a character. There may have been subtle inspirations for his character that were drawn from Richard Nixon, but absolutely he is not Nixon as he goes through the Star Wars galaxy and the Star Wars saga. And things like the Vietnam War, which were definitely in the height of George Lucas's formative years, that was what was going on, would end up giving him inspiration with many things that happened in the original trilogy as well. For example, looking at Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks fighting against the Empire, that's very much drawn from the idea of the Viet Cong fighting the American forces in Vietnam. Then you have the whole saga of the prequel trilogy, which in a way has been compared to the fall of the Roman Empire, and the purge of the Jedi has been compared to both the Knights Templar, who were wiped out in the 1300s, and also to the Night of the Long Knives, which was when Adolf Hitler consolidated power in Nazi Germany by having a whole bunch of his political rivals knocked off. And it isn't just political, of course, it's social as well, which, yeah, granted has its political aspects. But in the 70s, we had the feminist movement ramping up, and Princess Leia was an icon of that feminist movement, a princess who did not need to be rescued. That's exactly how she was designed by Lucas as a character. Somebody who would shoot first and ask questions later. Somebody who, once she got into the company of Luke and Han and Chewie, ended up giving orders and taking charge of the whole operation. And from a diversity standpoint, yes, absolutely. The original trilogy certainly is not a paragon of diversity in casting, but something that is worth noting is the fact that everyone in the Empire has always been depicted as being human, almost entirely male, and certainly pretty much entirely male in the original trilogy, and xenophobic. And so, yeah, by extension, the Rebel Alliance is arguing for exactly the opposite of that situation, and its leadership is female, with Mon Mothma, of course, in addition to Princess Leia. And the prequel trilogy certainly extends that idea and creates a very multicultural republic and also a very multicultural Jedi as well. And by multicultural for the Star Wars galaxy, we're also talking about multi-species too. And that's one of the real fascinating things about The Last Jedi, I think. The fact that, Rey happens to be the one that we're talking about as a Jedi. Yes, she's a white female, so, there is that whole situation to throw in. But the fact that she does not come from a Solo family or a Kenobi family or a Skywalker family, that is in the best tradition of the prequel trilogy. The idea that you don't have to be a Skywalker or a Solo or a Kenobi or anything like that in order to have Force powers and in order to have a significant Force powers. But getting back to the xenophobic idea of the Galactic Empire, then by extension, if you're fighting against that, then you're fighting for rights for not just all people in the galaxy, but all creatures in the galaxy too, using the word creatures for people who are not human, and therefore you could almost consider that a civil rights play as well. So there are all these sorts of socially progressive ideas in Star Wars, and it always seems to be the good guys that are depicted as the ones being on the side of these ideas. And so in that sense, it's really bizarre to see the phrase social justice warrior being used as a negative term with a negative connotation for what's happening in Star Wars, that it's being applied as a negative label to Kathleen Kennedy and Rian Johnson, when in fact it seems like what they're doing is actually continuing to espouse the ideas that George Lucas himself was building upon. Now, maybe there is a different definition for the idea of a social justice warrior. Maybe that's somebody who, takes the whole notion of social justice too far, perhaps. I don't know. But be that as it may, I think it's really strange to be knocking Kathleen Kennedy and Rian Johnson for those kinds of ideas when it seems like they're exactly the kind of ideas that George Lucas was espousing from the very get-go, which are the kinds of ideas that we have all loved Star Wars for the better part of 40 years in some cases. So there you go, brief overview of social, historical, political, philosophical ideas that are pretty amazing inside George Lucas's Star Wars saga, and now by extension the Star Wars saga that has been taken over under the helm of Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm. And that is going to do it for this last episode of the podcast before we hit the 4-year anniversary episode tomorrow. Over on the audio version of the podcast at sw7x7.com/iTunes or wherever you like to listen to podcasts, I'm going to do Last Jedi Trivia. But for now, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for watching, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.